I never imagined that the person I married would become my biggest source of heartache. At first, it was subtle, small arguments over little things, a sharp tone here, a cold glance there. But those tiny cracks widened faster than I could keep up with, turning our home into a battleground where love seemed to be the first casualty. It started one rainy evening when I came home late from work. I was exhausted, hoping to unwind, but instead I was met with a barrage of questions about where I'd been and why I didn't answer my phone. His voice was harsh, and his eyes were filled with suspicion that cut deeper than any shouted insult. I tried to explain calmly, but the more I talked, the more his anger seemed to grow. It wasn't about the phone or the time, it was something deeper, something I couldn't quite name then. That night, sleep escaped me, replaced by a knot of anxiety and confusion that settled in my chest. Days passed, and the tension only escalated. Every interaction felt like walking on thin ice, where one wrong step could shatter everything into 1,000 irreparable pieces. I caught myself holding back tears more times than I can count, wondering if this was what marriage was supposed to feel like. One afternoon, I found him staring blankly at his phone, his jaw clenched tight. When I asked what was wrong, he snapped, accusing me of not caring enough, of being distant. His words hit me like a punch to the gut, because I was trying, really trying, to make things work, but it felt like no effort was ever enough. Our conversations became battlegrounds, where blame was the weapon and forgiveness was a forgotten concept. I started to dread coming home, the place that once felt like a sanctuary, now a reminder of endless conflict and silent resentment. One night, after a particularly heated argument about money, he slammed the door so hard I jumped. The sound echoed through the apartment, and I sat there trembling, wondering how we had spiraled so far from the promises we made on our wedding day. I remember crying in the bathroom later that night, clutching the cold mirror as if it could somehow steady me. I felt utterly alone, even though he was just a few feet away. It was like we were living parallel lives, connected by memories, but separated by walls we had built ourselves. My friends started to notice the change in me, how I was quieter, more withdrawn. They asked if everything was okay, but I didn't know how to put the storm inside into words. It was easier to smile and say, "Fine," than to admit that my marriage was unraveling right before my eyes. One weekend, I found a note slipped under the bedroom door. It was short, cold, and full of resentment. The words stung more because they came from someone I loved so deeply. It was a wake-up call that things were worse than I wanted to admit, but I still didn't know how to fix them. We tried counseling, or at least I did. He agreed reluctantly, sitting stiffly across from the therapist, arms crossed, eyes avoiding mine. The sessions felt like walking through a minefield where one wrong word could ignite another fight. But for a moment, I dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back. Despite the efforts, the fights kept coming, sometimes about nothing, sometimes about everything. The exhaustion was overwhelming, the kind that sinks into your bones and leaves you numb. I found myself questioning not just our marriage, but who I was within it. There was a time when I looked forward to our evenings together, imagining a future filled with laughter and shared dreams. Now, those dreams seemed like distant echoes, drowned out by the constant noise of conflict and disappointment. One evening, after a particularly brutal argument about trust, he left without a word. The door slammed behind him, and silence enveloped the apartment. I sat alone, the weight of the emptiness pressing down on me, realizing how fragile the love I thought was unbreakable had become. In the quiet that followed, I found myself sifting through memories, our first date, the day we said "I do," the late nights talking about hopes and fears. It was hard to reconcile those moments with the cold distance now between us. I started to keep a journal, pouring my thoughts and fears onto the page. Writing became my refuge, a way to untangle the mess of emotions swirling inside me. Sometimes It felt like the only way to be heard when words failed in real life. One afternoon, he came home early, and for a brief moment, the tension lifted. We shared a meal in almost silence, the air lighter than it had been in weeks. It was a glimpse of hope, a reminder that beneath the anger, love still flickered, fragile but alive. But that hope was fleeting. The next day, the old patterns returned with a vengeance. Harsh words, cold shoulders, and the feeling that we were trapped in a cycle neither of us knew how to break. I started questioning my own worth, wondering if I was the cause of the chaos. Was I not enough? Was my love not enough? Those questions haunted me, eroding my confidence and making every day a struggle to keep going. Friends advised me to stand firm, to set boundaries, but it was hard when the person crossing them was the one I vowed to love in sickness and in health. Loyalty and pain tangled together in a confusing knot I couldn't unravel. One night I woke to the sound of him pacing the living room, restless and angry. I wanted to reach out, to bridge the gap, but fear held me back. What if I made it worse? What if the war we were fighting destroyed us both? I found myself retreating into silence more and more, hoping that if I said less, the fights would fade away. But silence became its own form of conflict, a cold war where love was the casualty and loneliness the victor. There was a moment when I caught him staring at me with a mix of frustration and sadness. It was like looking into a mirror, reflecting all the pain and disappointment we both carried but couldn't express. That gaze stayed with me long after he turned away. Sometimes I wondered if we were just two broken people who collided and shattered each other. It was terrifying to think that the love we built might not be strong enough to survive the storms we faced. I remember a rainy afternoon where we sat in the car, neither of us speaking, the silence louder than any argument. The rain streaked down the windows, blurring the world outside like the confusion inside me. That moment felt like a crossroads, but I didn't know which path to take. I tried to hold onto the good memories, clutching them like lifelines in the darkness. But the harder I held on, the more the present seemed to slip away, leaving only shadows where love used to live. One day I found a forgotten love note tucked inside an old book. Reading it brought a flood of emotions, hope, nostalgia, and a painful longing for what we once were. It was a bittersweet reminder that sometimes love needs more than just memories to survive. The fights weren't always loud. Sometimes they were quiet battles fought through cold stares and clenched jaws. Those moments were the hardest because the wounds were invisible but no less deep. I started to notice how our friends stopped inviting us to gatherings, as if everyone could sense the tension radiating from our fractured relationship. That isolation only made the loneliness inside our home more suffocating. One evening, I tried to break the silence with a simple question about his day, but it was met with a curt reply and averted eyes. The rejection stung, reinforcing the distance between us and feeding the cycle of pain. I found myself replaying arguments in my mind, searching for moments where I could have done things differently. The guilt was a constant companion, whispering that I was failing the person I loved most. There was a time when I believed that love was enough to conquer all obstacles. Now I wasn't so sure. Sometimes love felt like a battlefield where both sides suffered and no one truly won. I tried to reach out to ask for help, but sometimes it felt like the world didn't understand the complexity of our pain. It was easier for others to say, "Just fix it," than to live through the heartbreaking reality of a love-turned war. My heart ached every time I saw his face, torn between memories of tenderness and the harshness of our current reality. It was like loving a stranger who once was my best friend and now felt like an enemy. One morning, I woke up to an empty bed and a note saying he needed space. The words hit me like a storm, shaking the fragile ground beneath me. Space felt like a double-edged sword, necessary, but terrifyingly uncertain. During his absence, I felt the silence press in on me, filling the room with questions I couldn't answer. Was this the beginning of the end, or just a pause in a story still being written? I found myself wandering through our home, touching things that once held meaning: his favorite mug, the worn-out couch, the pictures on the wall. Each item was a silent witness to the love and war that had unfolded here. Friends tried to comfort me, but their words felt hollow against the weight of my solitude. It was a loneliness that only someone who's loved fiercely and lost that love in fragments could understand. I started to question what it meant to love someone when the very act of loving seemed to bring pain. Was love supposed to hurt this much, or had we lost something essential along the way? One evening he returned, and for a brief moment, the old warmth flickered between us. We talked quietly, cautiously, as if afraid to shatter the fragile thread holding us together. That night, hope felt possible, but fragile as glass. But the next day, the distance returned with a vengeance. Old resentments bubbled to the surface, and the war reignited with a fury that left us both wounded and weary. I started to realize that love alone couldn't heal the cracks that had formed. It needed work, patience, and a willingness to see beyond pain and anger to the person still standing on the other side. Sometimes I caught glimpses of the man I fell in love with, the one who held my hand during storms and whispered promises in the dark. Those moments were bittersweet, reminders of what was lost and what might still be saved. I began to understand that marriage wasn't just about the good times. It was about facing the storms together, even when the sky seemed impossibly dark. But living through those storms was exhausting, and I often wondered how much more we could endure. One day I found myself standing in front of the mirror, asking who I had become. The reflection staring back was tired and worn, but also determined. I realized that this battle wasn't just about us, it was about finding myself again amidst the chaos. I started small, reaching out to old friends, trying to rebuild the support network I had neglected. It was scary to be vulnerable again, but necessary if I was going to find a way through this. Our conversations slowly shifted from accusations to attempts at understanding. It wasn't perfect, and there were setbacks, but each small step felt like a fragile bridge over the chasm between us. I learned that anger often masked fear, the fear of losing each other, the fear of failing, the fear of the unknown. Recognizing that helped me soften my own heart, even when it felt like the war was relentless. One night we sat together, hesitant and quiet, just sharing space without the need to fill it with words or battles. It felt like a truce, however temporary, and a reminder that maybe love could still find a way. But the road ahead was uncertain. There were days when the old wounds reopened and the battles flared anew. It was exhausting, heartbreaking, and sometimes I felt like giving up. Yet I held on to the hope that love, even when battered, could heal. I started to see that our marriage was not a war to be won or lost, but a challenge to be faced together with honesty and courage. It was messy and painful, but also real and deeply human. There were moments when I caught him looking at me with something softer, a flicker of the man I married beneath the armor of anger. Those moments gave me strength to keep trying, even when the fight seemed endless. I realized that love doesn't always roar. It sometimes whispers in the quiet moments between the chaos, asking us to listen, to forgive, and to keep going. One evening, after weeks of silence, he reached out to hold my hand. It was tentative, almost scared, but it broke through the wall of pain that had kept us apart. That single touch felt like a fragile promise of something better. We started to talk more, really talk, about fears and hopes, mistakes and dreams. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't always pretty, but it was real. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were on the same side again. The journey wasn't linear. There were setbacks and moments of doubt. But slowly, the war zone began to heal, patch by patch, word by word, touch by touch. I learned that marriage isn't just about love. It's about resilience, forgiveness, and the fierce determination to hold on even when everything feels like it's falling apart. Sometimes, after the storms, there's a calm that feels like the first breath of new life. I'm still learning what that means for us, but I'm here, still fighting, still hoping. This story isn't finished, and maybe it never will be. Love is complicated, messy, and sometimes it feels like war. But it's also the reason we keep standing, keep fighting, and keep believing in the possibility of peace. I'm sharing this not because I have all the answers, but because I know I'm not alone. There are others out there wrestling with the same fears and heartbreaks, searching for a way back to love when it feels like war. If you're reading this and feeling the weight of a love-turned battlefield, know that your pain is real, your feelings valid, and your hope worthy. Sometimes, the hardest battles lead to the strongest hearts. I don't know what the future holds for us, but I'm choosing to face it with honesty, courage, and an open heart. Because even when love becomes war, it can still be worth fighting for. Every day is a new chance to rewrite our story, to find moments of peace amid the chaos, and to remember why we chose each other in the first place. It's not easy, but it's real, and that makes all the difference. The war between us is ongoing, but so is the love that sparked it. And in that complicated dance, I'm learning to hold on, to let go, and to hope for a tomorrow where love wins again.